So, I think in terms of just setting the tone, if I can start, Tim, with you. I mean, you in London, you know, you've been following Ukraine just for over a decade now, as long as I can remember, for so many years. So, if you could just set the tone, I mean, what are you seeing in London? I mean, we're seeing, you know, a lot of positive news coming out, but the reality still is how we're being perceived. So, what is the view you see in London of the perception that's going on? Timothy. Yeah.
Hello. Okay. Okay. Well, actually, I covered Ukraine close to 30 years. Okay. But anyway, never mind. That's maybe too long. I guess, you know, I'm a macro guy, and you know, I cover Russia, Ukraine, and the region, and it's mostly fixed income. So that's kind of my perspective. And when I look at the Ukraine story, for me, it's very binary, essentially. From one perspective, you know, and I'm not a micro guy, so we're clearly not dealing with you know, enterprises and corruption and all those kind of issues that I think we talked about in the first panel. It's very much top-down, you know, public finances, balance of payments, you know, macro stabilization and all that kind of stuff. And from the positive thing, you know, I see certainly in the Ministry of Finance and the National Bank of Ukraine a sea change, a really remarkable turnaround in the quality of the personnel that we're dealing with. I mean, I think, you know, it's the best by far that we've seen in terms of the certainly top echelons of the National Bank and the Ministry of Finance. And I think very much it's international standard. I mean, if you took out the management of the National Bank, you could put it into the management probably of the National Bank of Poland or the Central Bank of Turkey. I mean, it's that good. So the people that are making the big decisions in terms of Ministry of Finance and National Bank, you know, are very impressive. And, you know, so we're seeing some pretty good policy decisions, and you know, if you look at across the range in terms of National Bank policy, Ministry of Finance policy, I guess energy policy around Naftogaz, etc. I mean, I think, you know, it's all the right kind of things that I certainly want to see as a macroeconomist. I guess, you know, in terms of implementation of the IMF program, I mean, I think ownership of that program, which is pretty critical, is absolute. I mean, this is not an IMF-imposed program, which you often get in countries that have problems like Ukraine. I mean, this is the team, the National Bank team, the Ministry of Finance team, I think the presidency, I mean, they buy into it. I mean, you understand it, you get it, you realize, you know, for Ukraine's independence, you have to make some very, very difficult decisions, and those decisions, certainly at the macro level, very difficult and painful decisions in terms of capping or limiting wage increases, pensions, energy price liberalization, all that stuff. I mean, that's incredibly difficult to do anyway for any country. And I think the level of adjustment that we're seeing there is quite remarkable. I guess the pluses that I see going forward is if this team continues to deliver on the macro side, if we continue to see strong official sector support, obviously from the IMF and other Western official creditors, and obviously we had the recent agreements, I guess subject to bondholder approval of the debt restructuring. You know, the macro outlook for me looks pretty positive on the assumption that Russia essentially backs off and allows Ukraine to develop its own orientation, put it that way. The positives for me are, aside from the very strong policy team at the top level in terms of, is the base is incredibly low. I mean, you know, you look at the contraction of dollar GDP from $178 billion to maybe $84 billion this year. You know, a real GDP contraction of maybe 20% from peak to trough. I mean, that's wage levels. I mean, it was mentioned this morning. You know, it's devastating if you're an employee and you're receiving those kind of wage levels. But as a potential foreign direct investor looking at this country, it looks incredibly cheap. So I think the country could actually surprise in the short term in terms of the rebound. If there's peace in the East and peace and security, I think you could be surprised at how quickly real GDP growth bounces back. And actually, you could see very significant real exchange rate appreciation as well. So that's certainly a big positive from my mind. In terms of the fiscal and the balance of payments positions, you know, public finances have recovered quite remarkably. I think there's been certainly a lot of, you know, a very aggressive fiscal stance in terms of pensions and wages. And, you know, inflation certainly helps on the revenue side. So I think the fiscal performance has probably been a lot better than we expected. Obviously, the Naftogaz deficit is still significant and a drain in terms of the broader consolidated deficit. On the balance of payments side, I mean, we've seen stability. I mean, that's really encouraging. We've seen a big transformation in the current account deficit position from a deficit, if you go back 3-4 years, to 9 to 10% of GDP, possibly flat. Again, beating expectations. Capital flight has possibly stopped because of capital controls, admittedly. The debt deal, again, will help stop the drain on the capital account in terms of debt service payments. Reserves have stabilized, increased. I think it's not unreasonable, and people have criticized the IMF program for over-optimistic exchange rate assumptions. Again, with peace in the East, a frozen conflict even scenario, I think this country could bounce back relatively quickly. So short term, again, I think we could be surprised how well Ukraine performs. And then long-term growth really is dependent on all the kind of things that were mentioned this morning, essentially. It's the business environment, it's fighting corruption, it's making Ukraine absolutely the best place to do business. And, you know, for me, Ukraine, it ticks a lot of boxes in terms of if you're a foreign direct investor looking to invest in Europe, it's a very big country, big population, big domestic market, very skilled labor force, very, as I said, very now cheap, incredibly cheap labor force, probably the cheapest in Europe. I'm struggling to think of, I mean, Serbia for me was probably the cheapest prior to this. Ukraine is a very cheap, if you're a big foreign multinational company, potentially very attractive. Again, you know better than I do, but Ukraine has, huge potential in the agricultural sector, agro-processing, chemicals, metallurgy, all that kind of stuff could really pull in foreign direct investors, but you need peace and security. I mean, that's key. The foreign direct investors probably will only put big-size investments into the country if they think that your borders are secured in the east. Russia has stopped whatever it's planning to do, and you give the country the best business environment possible. I mean, it was very interesting that, Mikhail Saakashvili spoke earlier, and it's interesting he's been given the role here. I mean, Georgia, I mean, the transformation that his administration undertook in Georgia is quite remarkable. I mean, anyone who knows post-Soviet space, Transcaucasia in particular in terms of levels of corruption, I mean, to get rid of petty corruption to almost zero and retain it. I mean, if you go back now under the new administration, you talk to ordinary Georgians, I think there's perceptions there probably was always some higher level corruption, and there probably still is, but at the micro level in people's day-to-day business, the message is actually we've kept it. And that's remarkable. So you need something like that. And I guess Ukraine needs to be, you need to be very clear. You need to have a strap line. You need to be very ambitious in terms of your reform program. This is a wonderful opportunity. I mean, the Russians have done you a huge favor by ensuring you have no other choice. The choice is to be incredibly radical. You have maybe one chance at really transforming the country. This is it. There's only one way forward. It's the European Western orientation. Be incredibly ambitious. Be clear in terms of what you want to achieve. Someone reminded me that former Prime Minister, former President Kuchma, I think in 93 or 94, made the comment when he turned up to be Prime Minister that, I can build anything, but you need to tell me what you want to build. So I think you need to be clear what you're aiming to achieve. And I would argue, I've covered, again, Ukraine 30 years, and I also cover the whole of the region. And if you look back at the experience of emerging Europe, if you go back to the early 1990s and look at countries like Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, remember Czech Republic had an exchange rate crisis in 97. Poland restructured its external debt liabilities in 96. Bulgaria did the same, I think, in 97. Remember 1994, the Copenhagen criteria was set. In 1994, EU 12 or 10, I can't remember what it was, agreed that if emerging European countries met the Copenhagen criteria, which were a market economy and democracy and all those kind of things, in 10 years' time, in 2004, they will be allowed to enter the European Union. And we all laughed. I think the EU 12 agreed it because they never thought it was possible. They thought they were agreeing to something that pleased the East Europeans, but in the end, they would never deliver. But actually having that target, 2024, 10 years, if you meet these very clear, specific set of targets, you will join the European Union, it forces change. It really does. And I think whether or not we know what the European Union's like. I mean, they're full of their own problems. Enlargement is not really, the flavour of the month. They're never going to agree to give you a date. But I think, for your own good, it's good to set a date that's reasonably realistic, whether it's 10 years or whatever. Have a clear set of criteria that we're going to meet. You can take the Copenhagen criteria, for example, and say, in 10 years' time, we're going to meet these criteria. And let's see what happens in 10 years when, what the European Union looks like, but we're going to be ready. And this is going to be an anchor for those kind of micro-reforms that you need to do. And that will be possibly an anchor for foreign direct investment flows into the country. Just last thing, and I think you're going to huck me off the stage in terms of my commentary. I just came from Turkey, and I cover Turkey as well. I've covered it for a long time. And this idea of this anchor, this reform anchor, I mean, under AKP, the administration, until 2011, the country transformed remarkably and made real and significant reforms, both in terms of the economic space and in terms of democracy. And the key really is until 2011, the country had a realistic EU accession anchor. And then basically Merkel and Sarkozy started talking about the privileged partnership. The Turks realized the Europeans weren't serious. The Turks backed off. And since 2011, I would argue, in terms of the reform momentum in Turkey, it's gone backwards. Because essentially there is no anchor. You need a real anchor for this country. And I think in the end, you've set your own direction towards the European Union. It doesn't really matter whether or not you join the European Union, but if you meet the criteria that you're targeting, Ukraine will be transformed to a country that is pretty remarkable. And going back to people like Ali Babajan, the former Deputy Prime Minister, current Deputy Prime Minister of Turkey, always argued that, whether or not we join the European Union in the end, if we follow that, if we progress towards that goal, at the end, we'll have transformed ourselves into somewhere that is a really remarkable country, and we'll then make our own choice whether or not we want into the country. But I guess the anchor is the important one. So I'm optimistic. I think macro stabilization can happen next year, assuming the Russians stay out.
Could you give us some numbers on that? Some numbers.
Well, I mean, numbers. I mean, current accounts I can see flat current account position, maybe even a surplus. I mean, that's not impossible to imagine. Growth, it's finger in the air stuff. The base is very, very low, but a positive number, 2-3% growth is possible, right? And I could see really significant real exchange rate appreciation next year, assuming again the Russians stay out. Inflation is very high, but it could crash lower given exchange rate stability. We've seen it in many, many countries. But obviously the key is the security situation, political stability, maintenance of the reform coalition, backing reform legislation as it comes through, I guess.
Okay.